The Black Death. The Black Death was the name people gave to a terrible disease called the bubonic plague. It lasted for 2 years in Europe, from 1347 to 1349. In those 2 years, 25 million people died. That was 1/3 of all Europeans, or 1 out of every 3 people. Whole families disappeared. Farms and villages where cities came to a stop. Churches, universities, banks, and shops closed. How did this happen? Life in Europe in the Middle Ages was very different from life today. In 1300, there were no cars or trains. People walked, rode horses, or traveled in boats. There were no machines to help farmers or to make clothes. There were few factories. People made most of the things they needed by hand: clothing, shoes, food, tools. There were no printed books or newspapers. And of course, there was no telephone, internet, or television. The news traveled from one person to another by word of mouth. And it was usually bad news. Violence was a part of everyday life. There were wars that went on for years and years. Robberies and murders were common. People often died young from accidents or illness. In those days, most Europeans lived in small villages. But the cities were growing. In the early 1300s, the weather was colder and wetter than usual. Because of this bad weather, farmers often couldn't grow enough food for their families. Many country people didn't have enough to eat, so they went to the cities. The cities became more crowded and unhealthy. In fact, they weren't very pleasant places. The rich people had big, beautiful houses. But everyone else lived in dark, crowded little houses. No one, rich or poor, had running water or toilets. All the waste was thrown into the streets or rivers. This was one reason why the plague spread so easily. This disease was caused by bacteria. The waste from sick people's homes was full of these bacteria. Soon the streets and rivers and drinking water became very unhealthy. Many people got sick from drinking the dirty water. Others got sick from the waste in the streets and because of the rats. There were many rats, and they ran freely through the streets, in and out of houses. People then didn't understand that rats were part of the reason for the plague. The bacteria that caused the disease were carried on fleas that lived on rats. The plague started in China in the early 1300s. Today diseases move quickly from one part of the world to another. In the Middle Ages, diseases like people traveled more slowly. It took about 20 years for the plague to move west from China. At that time, rich Europeans liked to buy silks and spices from Asia. Traders could make a lot of money from these things, so they took long trips to get them. Sometimes they went over land, sometimes by sea. That was how the rats that carried the disease probably traveled by ship. By 1347, the plague had reached the countries around the Black Sea in Eastern Europe. In October of that year, an Italian ship stopped at a Black Sea town and picked up the disease. By the time the ship arrived at Messina in Sicily, Italy, many sailors were dead. A few days later, people in Messina were sick, too. They sent the ship away, but it was too late. The plague had arrived in Italy. For 2 years after that, village by village, town by town, the disease spread north through Europe. By the end of the year 1349, it had spread as far as Scotland and Norway. Only one part of Europe, central Poland and Lithuania, stayed free of the disease. No one knows why. What happened when the plague arrived in a town? People got sick and died fast. Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio wrote about the plague in Florence, Italy. How many men and women had breakfast with their families, and the same night, had dinner with their ancestors in the next world? Not everyone died the same day, but most people died within 3 days. And it was a horrible death. The first signs were black lumps around the neck and other places. That's why it was called the Black Death. Then, there was high fever and blood, and that was the end. No one understood what was happening or why. Many people thought it was a punishment sent by God. Some doctors in Paris thought it was caused by the planets and the stars. Other doctors believed it was caused by a bad smell. Cities with the plague smelled horrible. They told people to keep flowers and use perfume. Some people thought they could keep away the disease with loud noises, so they rang church bells and fired guns. None of these cures helped, of course. There was no cure in those days. There was no way to help a sick person. People were terrified. Some stayed in their homes and didn't let anyone in. But the fleas and rats went in and out, and so did the disease. Other people ran away from the cities and into the country. The countryside was probably healthier than the city, but these people often brought the disease with them, and they helped to spread it. In some towns in Germany and France, people also got angry. They wanted to find someone to blame for the plague, so they blamed the Jews. They said the Jews had put poison in the water. Angry groups of people went to the Jewish neighborhoods. They set fire to houses and killed whole families. In Strasbourg in 1349, 200 Jews were burned to death. In those years, many Jews moved east, to Poland and Lithuania. The disease died down in 1349, but it didn't disappear completely. It came back many times in Europe, though it never again spread so far so fast. The last big outbreak was the Great Plague of London in 1665, when about 100,000 people died. After that there were smaller outbreaks in Marseilles, Vienna, Moscow, and other cities, until the early 18th century.